The obstruction of David Bull starts at the time of the case, which starts at the preamble with the Legend of David companies, which are the foundational presumption of those who have a need or an interest in order to sell him things in exchange for other resources, which they expect him to be able to acquire, and having estimated that he would be able to produce certain products they would want to sell him something in exchange that he might give them that product at an agreed upon exchange on his brokerage, which then materializes the exchange of services with the satisfaction. Now, they, having access to the military intelligence, would actively be able to mature this function exponentially to produce the highest net interest outcome for their personal objectives. Now, this requires them to make several estimates, which then materialize as their personalized, infinitely diverse goals to use those finances when restructuring themselves according to the contract schedule agreed to when they buy services or purchase contracts to the right to do the services that would be figured out, then traded on the brokerage, which then materializes certain presumptions, such as their presumption that David is the king of a constitutional kingdom, which then materializes the function of the crash of '08 being solved by him, which then functions to the position of Greece having received the primary injury from the crash of '08, which then would materialize David's interest or obligation to fix Greece from the crash of '08, which as a primary interest in the European states materializes the exponential acceleration by their support of that service, which then would be contracted through that function of the constitutional kingdom, creating the consulate, materializing the economic insurance treaty, which then materializes the protection against those injuries as it would dissolve to each of the checkpoints as it purchases the insurance, as an example. Now, to this extent, Greece does not speak English, Greek speaks Greek. And to this extent, the mechanism of David having to start at birth materializes the function of him having to do the works with the injuries before he receives the primary education. To this extent, the School of Hard Knocks materializes the practical function of those services, which have to be gotten at step by step by step, including the function of the international language of math, which then materializes the function of those who exchange amongst different countries with a mediating language, which is easy enough for them to do, which then materializes the question of what the insurance would have to have produced for this. And that extent facilitates the function of any of those languages having to be able to accommodate those who have other defects, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of being mute, requiring them to engage in sign language, which materializes the function of each of the countries having prospect people who need to speak sign language in order to do any work whatsoever, requires this as an absolute mandatory function uh, to be the international language of math and sign language, which then is the easiest thing for everyone to be compelled to learn despite their nation of origins and the languages therein, which then materializes the solution which allows countries that have very little to do with each other to be able to communicate without an active translator, as each of them would be specialized in the sign language itself or the mutually common language. Now, to this extent, the function of the obstruction, such as from the record Lindsey Graham's Confederacy, seeking to eradicate the capitalist system in favor of white supremacist communism, materialize obstructions to the contract schedule against the American law for the purpose of insurrection, and that contract schedule presumes the function of David acquiring the position of the majority government normally, which was then targeted to be dismantled as an act of treason, which then materializes the assumption of at the majority function would then become intelligence oversight enforcement and investigations for Congress, which puts David's forces above the President of the United States according to authority, at which point he would be able to commandeer any executive forces which belong to Congress. By definition, all of the executive is subordinate to the Congress according to checks and balances, which then materializes the function of restraints against the President of doing illegal actions against the order of Congress in systemic contempt for Congress, which is acknowledged in the Church Committee, which stated that the intelligence community's excuse for being able to continue their various operations is the construct that the white hats, that's their presumption of the Legend of David Company, would be able to have control over the black hats, materializing the subordination as a professional military force to the government, which then subordinates them functionally to Congress, who has intelligence oversight or the authority over the executive, according to these functions, by such powers as that, as well as the power of the purse, legislation, and all others. To this extent, the ability to use the executive requires them to follow in place with, that's right, the legislation, which then materializes the function of the excuse for them to use executive functions under those definitions and to not break the boundaries of those legislative definitions. To this extent, that act of sedition materializes the insurrection against the United States, which is by law a self enacting function of disqualification from office in the United States. So, by definition, no one in Congress who supports that insurrectionist war on David is legally congressman. So, therefore, they, not being a member of Congress, or never had the authority to be in Congress, materializes their non-ability to engage in any legislative actions, and therefore all Confederate actions or legislations are nullified immediately and to be replaced by the projection of the obstructed American policies, which then would have been understood according to their estimates, which they, being guilty, are sensitive to, and thus hide themselves from and create obstructions for and protect themselves from, which is their counteraction, which acknowledges the legitimacy of the claim that they know what the thing is and just aren't telling like a guilty, filthy criminal. And this includes the function of their obstruction of the School of Hard Knocks for its purpose of stopping it from being established, and thus the removal of credibility by a early policy, which then materialized the action of requiring certification with other universities, which the Confederacy has been seeding according to its social engineering program, which generates the woke radical Marxists, which are an extension of the Confederacy, which is a white trash communist revolution, which being that is going to promote Marxism in the universities, and thus all of the craziness that you see in the universities and misbehaviors and eccentricness and the rest of that is specifically social engineered by the psyops from the Confederacy, who are engaging in fake experiments and abuses against the various members of the population, including the harassment and the creation covertly on fake experiments, breaking constitutional laws such as the right of the person to be secure in their body, which then engages in the function of them being manipulated into a different sexuality, which is a fear Vladimir Putin has, would otherwise be afflicted against the Russians, which he's interested in protecting against. This materializes the function of their rejection of the School of Hard Knocks certification, which was acknowledged as the legitimate outcome, as well as necessary to the function of the social good. To this extent, their act of treason is simply attacking the function for the exponential expansion of the destruction of the country as it's pulled apart in all of its various ways from the demoralized forces who have converted from the Confederate white supremacists terrorist operations to the Communist Revolution according to the Soviet Union's plan to demoralize the people so that even if they were shown and proven the truth that they would reject it because they are so disconnected from reality according to communist propaganda based on humiliation, where they have been tricked into consistently lying. The act of convincing them to lie by the humiliation tactics from their propaganda materializes the function of their delusional state as a perpetual threat against the country as they infiltrate and dismantle as an insurgent terrorist operation as double agents against the United States as an enemy combatant in war without a legal government. With that being understood, David being arrested as the patriarchy as an infant materializes the obstruction of the School of Hard Knocks operations, which would have had the brokerage from the Legend of David companies distributing contracts, which he would have actively been part of, as he would have been doing the work with full protections and advisors and teachers and insurance agents guaranteeing the full prosperous outcome in order to engage in the legitimate conclusions from the services as a fully functioning faculty, which then materializes the function of it evolving into needing to know all of the other subordinate skills, which then would contract with the School of Hard Knocks to the other subordinate skills, such as languages or writing, math, or anything that specifically needs any specific skill set. It could be any artistic skill, it could be any business skill, anything that needs to be done as an unavoidable thing is the refined, perfected trade that is provided as the primary service from the School of Hard Knocks, which then materializes the function of the investment into the purchase of the access to the School of Hard Knocks normal services, which then materializes the additional investments for each of the companies and services which would have to be invested into, which would be constructed systemically by the classes in the outrageous specialty trade school, which originally is projected to have been provided to Don Senior Bowles, which then would have been the primary overseer of that function, as many of the services provided through him would have been selling him these university functions, which would make him a chief administrator for them, allowing him to do his continued education with a larger family without it causing a problem, as the school system would be a boarding school. It would be easy for all of them to live in each of the locations as they invest exponentially into finer and finer accommodations. This, of course, would allow him to materialize the various exchange services, such as the Legend of David brokerage functions and others, which then become subordinate services that he would prefer to have disconnected to himself. As it is said, the rich own nothing, but they own things that own everything, and thus the exchange of the function of dividing the identity of the resources exponentially creates the function of the origin of the Legend of David company, which could be started by anyone in particular publicly and secretly, which then materializes the function of how it would be arranged upon investigation. That investigation, of course, was found by the Confederacy and illegally disclosed to them despite their lack of classification or clearance, which then materializes the function of the threat to national security. Now, the demoralized insurgents conducting the insurrection, using classification and other systems in order to destroy the United States from the inside, according to the old saying that if anyone was to destroy the United States, it would not be a foreigner from the outside, but it would come from corruption within, and thus the function of the demoralization process being targeted, knowing this quote and exercising it perfectly, would conduct that exact threat, which then materializes the obligation of all the national security policies specifically allotted towards the arresting of threats to the constitutional government to be executed immediately and with extreme force. which then materializes in the function of the duel, which is David's right to pursue a remedy with the government, which has the specialty of Congress, which is obligated in that regard to acknowledge the obstructed title according to the contract schedule being obstructed, as to acknowledge the original status, as to acknowledge the faculties, which creates the function of David's original money, and money is speech when talking with the government. And to this extent, that has to be acknowledged and restored in order for the function of the pursuit of the remedy to initiate. Otherwise, it is a mishmash of obstructions and drunk notes, hilariously. At which points, all of the ums and ims and stutters and bafflements and nonsense would actively be dissolved in favor of the refined, perfected quotes of all of the systemic lined up codes, which then would materialize into a material professional report for Congress, which will detail their obligation, not right, not interest, but duty, the prerequisite to being Congress, as a declaration of war against enemies of the Constitution, delivering to David as intelligence oversight the entirety of the United States military to enforce that war against threats to these United States. Now, this obstructed title of David's will include all of the obstructed education's advancements concerning tax saving functions, such as nonprofits, such as Roth IRAs, conducting the original investments into the Roth, which then creates all of the other accounts which are subordinate to the Roth, which then allows for all of the payments to be delivered to those subordinate companies and accounts inside of the Roth, allowing them to grow tax free as the base estimate, amongst other complicated strategies which would have been actively invested in by the function from the School of Hard Knocks education certified, which then materializes the function of their obstruction to David's other material advantages, such as the restraints for defamation as retaliation for these functions of his superiority to themselves, which includes the human trafficking by the surveillance terrorism, which includes the use of the electronic subversions, which then includes the microwaves and other surveillance techniques, which then conduct various assaults in order to create awkward situations, and defamations, which include but are not limited to compelled bodily action, which then materializes the function of their ability to restrain him from demonstrating the original value in any of the projected skills that they would have recited, he being better than their marked person, according to the black market, would then be attacked in that particular value or skill in order to counteract their certified valuated price for that thing, allowing him to be defamed as a POW or prisoner of war held by enemies of the United States. Then materializes the function of the various abuses against him, such as, but is not limited to, the function of the obstructions of the engagements of games or other social engagements, which would have generated social validations and other benefits which are necessary to the function of the normal forming of relationships, such as the dating world, which then materializes the function of the obstructed sexual market value, which, having been concealed according to Plato's conspiracy of the secret wizard council, materializing function of predetermining who gets to be in a relationship with whom, materializing the function of all women becoming prostitutes in service and property of that communist arrangement, and thus an active thief if they engage in sexual relationships outside of that boundary, qualifying the punishment of the thief to suffer the various furies, materializing that activity as a social norm creates the function of these various harassments, which then makes people uncomfortable according to the record, which then materializes the function of them being coerced against the associations and respecting the illusions redirected price control rents or rent controls for the price fluctuation for the white supremacist communists materializes the function of them not being able to conduct any legitimate social engagement or romantic interest, and thus the action materializes, according to its definition, that they stole the patriarchy from women, which then materializes the function of why women have been suffering so much, according to this obstruction, at which point they're systemically being harassed and abused and social engineered and materially compelled into place according to this rapist culture, which then materializes their activities of just deal with whatever they are provided according to those arrangements as they are harassed into the contract schedule as cattle, materializing their lack of autonomy over their own body, which then materializes the function of it not being their body, so it cannot be their choice. At which point, the question of whether or not they should have their abortion uh, has been devolved into the function of no abortion unless in cases of rape or incest, which by definition is all active sexual relationships under this system from the Confederacy, as the function of those coercions from this elaborate illusion network materializes the harassment by the surveillance rapists as an act of rape, and thus the subversion of all sexual opportunities into the rape contracts, and thus the function of the prisoners having been trafficked are in fact both raped in that example, and the person that they are being abused with is not the rapist, but the surveillance agents engaging in the coercion and subversion of the options against the law, which then materializes the function of the byproduct being a rape child, and thus the action of the qualification which would not be acknowledged by the rapist in question, as it would acknowledge that they are anti-feminist, toxic feminine uh, rape cult in worship of Satan in the various exchanges, such as the function of the pursuit of Frazzle Ghul's strategies according to D&D, which then materializes the characteristic of the god they worship. To this extent, this materializes the function of the various illusions, which then materializes the action of them not being able to make the choice in the first place, which would have been registered as a rape, which would have justified the function of the abortion, which would not be acknowledged according to the secrets being obstructed, which then materially forces them to accept all of their rape and incest children, as they would not be able to physically claim rape or incest. And thus, the exceptions aren't exceptions because their abuser is the government pretending that they didn't always know better. Now, this rape culture is actively enforced by the toxic feminine female Gnostics, which are an off branch function of the Marxist arrangements, its incorporation into Gnostic beliefs, which then engages in the function of the material witchcraft, which is founded on the violation of the definition by toxic is when they can't let you go, but they can't treat you right either, which then materializes the very important question of their various harassment or struggle sessions, which then engages in the traumatization and social injury of the person in the psychological traumas generated by their various schemes, materializing into the social engineering by the hate crime of social violence, which then materializes the magical outcome that they were looking for, which is why they behave according to that toxic feminine trait, which then functions as the material engagement of advancing the white supremacist communism as they destroy the country into its degrowth position by their system of the advancements of cancelings and contracting hate crimes to be distributed amongst the general public for arbitrary means, which then materializes the function of the communist revolution's function of the fake argument that the revolution will remain bloodless unless the Democrats don't force us to, then materializes the question of what happens in the communist revolution. The answer is the revolution begins its purges once it's engaged in the capture, which then begins to sacrifices everyone who was dumb enough to support it in the meantime, as they, according to all of the other communist revolutions in the past, especially the Chinese Revolution, materializes the function of turning all of the loyal Communist Party supporters against each other in order to prove through violence who is materially loyal to the Communist Party. Uh, Engaging in that mass sacrifice pit materializes the actual blood in question from that arrangement is from the hyper accentuated function of civil war, but the function of the civil war is not the function of civil war, but the function of anarchical bloodshed, which then is in its material fact an act of sacrifice or blood sacrifice to Satan, which is their state established religion. Just as a little example of what the Bible's position on these types is, Saul died and became because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He did not keep the word of the Lord and even consulted a medium for guidance. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who wants to kill you is trying to kill me too, so you will be safe with me. He sacrifices his children in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, practiced divination and witchcraft, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spirits. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord. And thus the function of them pursuing these activities, such as the military intelligence equipment, which may include Project Looking Glass, which has materialized their biased estimate of the spirit world into a kind of Fey-Wild arrangement, which then facilitates their ability to conjure up their imagination of the devils, which they make contracts and worship, and thus the action of them doing so is the material version of this very same thing historically referred to under the United States taxpayer system, and thus the action of everyone who claims to be a good, upstanding, Bible-believing Christian would, by definition, have to be aghast and set back at such audacities on how to spend their resources against their more and most fundamental moral core. Unless, of course, they're lying, in which case it's just some arbitrary distraction that they would like to publicly tell people according to a virtue signal process, which is the active function of being convinced to lie for the Communist Party, which has humiliated you into complying with saying things that you objectively do not feel is true. And thus, the action of disconnecting you from reality allows you to be processed like any other product, as you are no longer a thinking material individual, but a cog in their fascist machine, a yin and the yang, as there's a little bit communism inside of their fascism, and there's a little bit of fascism inside of their communism. And in the system that exchanges, it has attached itself to the larger system that the mostly fascist little communist confederacy connected with the mostly communist little fascist CCP becomes the relationship designed in order to make the exchanges to sell the rights of the United States for the rights of conquest, where all of the security and law enforcement agents have already agreed according to that arrangement to refuse to do their job according to the sales and transfers, which is taking a payment in order to commit treason against these United States.